Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with Stephen Webb. Stephen is a physicist and the author of numerous books, including one entitled, If the Universe is Teeming with Aliens, Where is Everybody? The second edition of which includes 75 solutions to the Fermi Paradox. I wanted to talk to Stephen to explore the nature of the Fermi Paradox. Stephen and I had a chance to examine what the Fermi Paradox is, the interdisciplinary nature of the approaches to this puzzle, science fiction as a, quote, playground for thought experiments, and the three main categories for how people approach the Fermi Paradox, and even how AI has changed how we might think about intelligence in the universe. This conversation was a lot of fun, and I had a great time speaking with Stephen. Let's begin. Stephen, so great to be chatting with you, and welcome to the Orthogonal Bet.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure. It's taken a while, I know, for me to hook up with you, but we made it in the end.
Yes, no, this is wonderful. So I guess the best place to start is with the Fermi Paradox. What is it?
Okay, well, it is the puzzle, the tension, if you like, between our perhaps naive expectations that when we look out into the universe, we're going to see alien beings. We're going to see examples of life. And the reason we expect that, of course, is that the universe is big. There's a gazillion planets, a gazillion places where we think life could get started. And presumably, some of that life could be a lot older than us, a lot more advanced than us. They should be able to disturb the universe in some way that we could detect. Perhaps they could be here, and if not their craft, at least the photons that they might want to send out into the universe could have reached us. So we have this expectation that the universe should be teeming with life. The observation, and I know some people will disagree with that, but the observation is that we don't see any of that, that the universe is silent, that we see no evidence for life, no signals. So the Fermi Paradox is really that tension, that question that Enrico Fermi, a terrific, wonderful physicist of the last century, asked around about 1950, where is everybody? And in a nutshell, that's what paradox, as it's called, is.
Okay. Yeah. And then is the reason it's referred to as a paradox because of that tension between sort of the expectation and the reality?
Yes. I mean, you could reasonably argue that it's not Fermi's and it's not a paradox. With Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, 20 plus years before Fermi, had the same question. Tsiolkovsky was a pioneer of rocketry. He wanted to get humankind off the planet, out of the cradle. But he thought, well, if we're going to do this, surely other beings out there would do the same thing. He had this feeling for cosmic unity. So Tsiolkovsky realized that there was something weird about this question well before Fermi. And the person that really pushed it as a paradox was a guy called Hart about 20 years after Fermi. But Fermi's such a big name, his became attached to this question. But you could argue that it's not really a paradox in the sense that there's no logical contradiction going on here. There's no breaking of the laws of physics or anything like that. Rather, it's a big, unanswered, puzzling question. And I'd argue it's perhaps the most interesting, puzzling question in all of science. That's
super interesting. Yeah, and what led you, to begin thinking about the paradox or this puzzle or whatever we want to call it, and eventually to write a book with kind of all the different approaches to this?
Well, I grew up on a diet of science fiction, typical nerdy kid.
As did I.
So, watching films like Forbidden Planet and watching Star Trek and the big three, Asimov, Heinlein, Clarke, but all the other guys, and to a lesser extent women. It was just part of my mental furniture that there must be life out there. It's what science fiction was telling me, and it's what science is continuing to tell us, right? That the universe is so big, there's so many places out there, there must be life. So I took it for granted that there was, and it came then as a real shock to me when I read an article in Asimov's science fiction magazine back in 1984, which was about the Fermi Paradox. And it just sort of stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, well, I have to examine this assumption that we're all making. And I started reading about the paradox, and it became clear that lots of people were addressing this question, but from all sorts of different angles. And I found it fascinating, just the wide range of different viewpoints that people have had and continue to have on this question. And I just got into the habit of collecting them. And eventually I had 50 of them, which was enough for a book. Back in 2002, I think it was. And the solutions kept on coming. So 12, 13 years afterwards, I published a second edition with 75 solutions. And they keep on coming. I can't believe anyone's interested in 100 of the damn things. So if there's a third edition, perhaps a different approach is needed. But it's still an open question. It's still, to my mind, a fascinating question.
Yeah. And so related to what you were talking about earlier when you were saying, like, this is like one of the most fundamental questions, like one of the reasons, I feel like there's many, many reasons it's fundamental and intriguing. One is just kind of understanding our place in the universe relative to if there are other intelligences and things like that. But it also is really interesting because oftentimes in the process of thinking about the question, you're forced to actually think about so many different domains of knowledge. You're not just thinking about astrophysics, you're also thinking about maybe the grand arc of civilizations and technological advancement, all these different kinds of things. And one of the things that science fiction is very good at doing is this very holistic sort of approach to like thinking about all the different ramifications of technological ideas and running thought experiments. And so as you began to explore the Fermi Paradox, where did the most interesting thinking actually come from? Was it from many different branches of science? Was it from the realm of fiction, specifically science fiction? Was it kind of this weird mashup where as science proceeded, new science fictional ideas kind of came about? Like just out of curiosity, what is sort of the interplay between all these different domains of knowledge, including fiction and nonfiction?
Well, you're right, Sam. I think that's a fascinating question, and that there is this interplay. I mean, it goes back at least, I think, to Wells, H.G. Wells, and it's clear that the novels that he wrote influenced a generation of scientists. And then what science was doing fed back into science fiction, and the cycle continued. And scientists like Carl Sagan, we know, got interested in science because of science fiction and ended up writing some of it himself. Cosmologists like Fred Hoyle wrote science fiction as well as being a great scientist. Martin Rees has said you can learn more from first-rate science fiction than you can from third-rate science. So going back to your question, I got inspiration, if you like, from all of those different domains, and certainly science fiction was one of them. And it continues. I mean, fairly recently, the three-body problem, for example, has the Fermi Paradox right at its heart. It's addressing that question. And what science fiction, I think, is really good at is, as you said, providing this playground for thought experiments. And you can be perhaps a little bit wilder and wackier in the fictional realm. But I'd argue that actually some of the fiction is no wackier or further out there than some of the scientific suggestions that are coming. So yes, it's fascinating. It's a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach, and science fiction definitely has a role to play in examining the question.
I love this. And before I want to get to some of those wacky examples from the realm of science, but before I do that, maybe we can just kind of take a step back, and because in your book you have almost this like larger taxonomy of sort of the different ways people have tried to address this paradox. Maybe you can kind of just talk a little bit about the different categories of I don't know if solution is the right answer or the right term for this, but ways of addressing this puzzle. Yeah, purely
for ease of approach in organizing the book. It was really just an organizational matter. I classified the approaches into three. There's a set of proposed solutions, for want of a better word, or approaches that just say, well, they're here, they exist, and they're here. In which case the paradox just vanishes because they're here. And it's not as straightforward necessarily as saying, well, UFOs or UAPs or whatever we're going to call them. It's not just a case of pointing to them and saying, that's our proof. That you can be a bit more subtle with these sorts of solutions. You could say, for example, that we're all aliens and that Earth came to be inhabited by life from panspermia. It came from elsewhere. And that's actually a reasonable scientific approach to the question of the origin of life, panspermia. If you go one step further and say directed panspermia, that some civilization actually deliberately seeded Earth, it's an approach, or one of those wacky approaches, you could say that, well, we're all living in a simulation. It's a simulation being run by aliens, so we don't have any existence other than in some alien's computer. So there's those sorts of approaches that you can take, as well as the UFO abduction sort of approach. A bigger category is, well, they exist and they're out there. We just haven't heard from them for whatever reason. And that's perhaps the default position for most of science. And the reason could be something as banal as, well, it's just too hard to travel across interstellar distances or even send messages. Maybe it's just too hard. You need perhaps two civilizations to be the same point in evolutionary terms at the same time, and maybe it just hasn't happened. Or that third class is, well, we can solve the paradox by saying they don't exist. They're not here, and we don't see them because they're not there, and it's just us. And that's quite a scary approach in some ways. But certainly there are a range of reasons why that could be the case. For instance, perhaps abiogenesis, the creation of life from non-life. Maybe that's just an incredibly rare event. Or maybe civilizations come into being and they inevitably destroy themselves. Intelligence plus opposable thumbs is perhaps not a very good long-term evolutionary approach. Maybe natural disasters play a role, variety of approaches there. So that was the taxonomy. They exist and they're here. They exist and perhaps are in our future. We might one day come to see them, or they're not there at all.
And then, how has, I guess, going back to what we were saying before of like the wacky science that's kind of weighed upon some of these kinds of things. Like what are, some of these, not necessarily, it doesn't need to be wacky science, but kind of like novel interdisciplinary approaches that have been able to weigh in on, I guess, either shedding light or providing some sort of approach to these kinds of, to the paradox.
Well, going back to just straightforward basic science, I think it's worth mentioning in case I forget to mention it. Science has made incredible advances. I mean, it's almost difficult to comprehend the level of advance that's been made over the past 75 years since Fermi asked that question. I'm thinking in terms of a reasonable approach to that question 75 years ago would be to say, well, maybe the solar system is a rare event, because it was still plausible back then that the way the solar system came into being was via a close encounter of the sun and another star. That encounter pulled material off the star or from the sun, and that condensed to form the planets. That would be a relatively rare event. We now know that's not the case because we can detect exoplanets, and I still find it amazing. I'm privileged to be around when science is doing this, that we can even image exoplanets. So we know that that's not a solution. We know that there are lots and lots of planets out there. If you have a star, pretty much you're going to have a planetary system. Back when Fermi asked his question, there was no search for extraterrestrial intelligence. There was no SETI program. That's another advanced set of observational techniques that astronomers can throw at this problem is just incredible compared to 75 years ago. And people like Frank Drake, they've looked at individual stars. More recently, Breakthrough Listen, they've looked at entire galaxies, looking for perhaps a K2 or a K3 civilization. That's a civilization that can draw on the energy resources of an entire star or even an entire galaxy. So the amount of observation that's taken place over those 75 years in the radio, but also in the optical, in fact, across the electromagnetic spectrum now, we can even detect, who would have thought it was possible back then, neutrinos. I mean, the neutrino wasn't detected until 1956, and now we can detect them from the depths of space. We can even detect gravitational waves. Science has just increased our knowledge hugely. And as Asimov said, it's the tragedy is it's increasing our knowledge faster than we're increasing our wisdom. But I think it needs to be said that what science has done, I think, is just made the puzzle, the paradox, if you want to call it that, even sharper.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, well, certainly resonate when you were mentioning about like, yeah, like the discovery of extrasolar planets. Like I remember that in like the mid 1990s when that first became a thing, and like yeah, like my children are not going to grow up in a time where it was an open question
Yeah.
about planets
Yeah.
and around other stars. Like we now know, right? It's basically it's always, it's not quite always, but it's very very likely that every star has planets around it, which is unbelievable. And related to that, like both and you were mentioning like actually trying to detect these like highly advanced civilizations that are harnessing the energies of entire galaxies, and we're now testing for these kinds of things, and people more broadly are looking at just around what they call techno signatures, trying to find signatures of technological civilizations in lots of different ways. And on the one hand, right, we have a lot more data. On the but conversely, all the data is coming up empty. Now, of course, just because we have not found anything yet, and there's still a lot
Huge.
of the universe to actually explore. That being said, I mean, as you see these advances being made, do you feel that it's kind of leaning much more towards that final category of saying, yeah, we maybe are alone?
For me, yes. I think that this whole search for extraterrestrial intelligence is in a sense a search for ourselves. When we go through the list of features that we think must be met in order for an advanced civilization to make its presence felt across interstellar distances, we end up describing ourselves, really. We need abiogenesis to take place on a planet that has a stable climate for billions of years, which is probably not something that's common. We've got to get from single-celled primitive forms of life to multicellularity. We have to develop then into a complex organism that has a social aspect to it, because reaching across the stars is not something presumably a single individual creature could do. So you need some sort of social creature. You need a creature with a language, with a complex grammar to be able to describe what's going on and plan and coordinate and make this thing happen. You need a creature presumably with manipulative ability. And all this has to take place presumably, and I might be sounding very anthropomorphic here, and it's difficult not to, but presumably that has to all take place on a terrestrial planet that has sufficient oxygen, that things like metallurgy can take place, because you're not going to reach space, presumably, without technology and things like metals, and so on and so on and so on. The more I think about it, the more it seems to me that we're looking for creatures that so closely resemble ourselves. But you look at the number of steps that were required to reach us, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if that particular path was incredibly rare. And in some ways, I find it strange that we look out into the universe and seem to expect beings that we can identify with because they're intelligent, and the thing that defines us is our intelligence. We're going to find that out there when the creatures that are closest to us, with whom we've shared such a lot of evolutionary story, they're not the creatures we're looking for. Instead, we're looking for creatures with whom we share only prebiotic chemistry and expect them to have such a similar path of evolution that we can somehow communicate with them. So it wouldn't surprise me if it is just us, even though I think that is quite a scary solution. It puts a huge burden, I think, on humanity, and it's not something I would like. I want to exist in that Star Trek Forbidden Planet universe of my youth, but I don't think we do.
Yeah. And so is that what you would describe as your kind of personal approach to the Fermi Paradox, which is that once we've kind of realized that we've so narrowly described what we're looking for, that we can actually interact with or look for in terms of some intel, or is your kind of personal take a little bit different than that?
No, that's sort of it. I think it's absolutely crucial, though, that we keep looking, that we perhaps broaden our definition of what it is we're looking for, that our definition of life even might need to be slightly refined or redefined. But I think it's such an important question, the role that biology plays in the universe, if any, that we have to throw everything at this. I think it is such an important scientific question.
And so how do you reconcile your own take, like that personal take that you just mentioned, with, and going back to science fiction, there's many there's many science fiction stories that that try to imagine these radically different sort of alien intelligences or civilizations. On the one hand, they are wildly different than us. They might not, and they're not necessarily evolving on an Earth-like planet. There may be some weird sentient cloud of dust in space. On the other hand, though, one of the reasons why it could still accord with that is the fact, like, the more different they are, the greater the chance we just actually have no way of even interacting with them. Like, how do you kind of think about and especially and you were talking about the Kardashev scale. If we are agnostic as to kind of the specific biological nature, and we just say, okay, it's going to be something that harnesses this level of energy, presumably, even if we can't communicate with them in some sort of meaningful way, we might be able to still detect evidence of these wildly different sort of intelligences.
Well, that's partly one of the factors that leads me to think that maybe we are alone, because if you have optimism about the future of humanity, which I do, even though you look around you and you think, God, no, we have no chance. But if you are optimistic and you think that we will go out there and, as I say, disturb the universe and do things on a broad scale, even if we don't fully understand what a different life form might take, we presumably could differentiate the product of that technology and the effects that technology has on the universe from the usual physical, chemical processes that we understand. At present, everything, all these observations that we have made, astronomers have made, we can interpret purely in terms of natural, physical, physics-based solutions. And I would love to be proven wrong. I would love the observation to be made of something where we say, really don't understand how that can be explained other than with some biological or some non-natural explanation. But it requires something more than just pointing to a comet and saying, oh, that looks strange, because we can understand comets. We don't need to postulate some sort of engine on comet to explain what we see in terms of Atlas 3I at present or Oumuamua in the past.
Well, I was going to say, and similarly, like if you look at either, I think like pulsars or quasars or some of these various kind of things, when they were first discovered, I think, right, people thought, oh, maybe this is some sort of like regular patterned kind of phenomenon. And then, of course, we actually discovered it was a natural phenomenon. I'm not sure if I got that entirely correctly. Or there have been, I think, certain stars that have kind of either dust clouds around them that are kind of more patterned, and people say, oh, maybe this is some sort of like Dyson sphere kind of thing. And right, it is very easy to jump to those kinds of conclusions, but just because you cannot explain something immediately does not therefore mean that it cannot ever be explained, and therefore we should just kind of cut off questioning and keep on trying to understand it.
That's right. And it's a difficult question, I guess, in terms of scientific methodology. Just at what point do you say this has got us so puzzled that actually ET is the best explanation? But the pulsars, I mean, when it came around, it was brand new. They even called it LGM-1, Little Green Man 1, because they couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for why this regular pulse would be coming. And then I think presumably fairly quickly they'd have thought, well, if it's intelligence, it's very, very boring intelligence. It's just bop, 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 bop all the time. And then, of course, physicists came up with what we take as being the correct explanation, a rotating neutron star. Presumably, we will continue as we see more of the universe, and it is an interesting place. There's lots of things in there. Presumably, we will see things that we cannot immediately explain in terms of our current understanding. But yes, then the question becomes, how do we increase our understanding and explain those things in terms of known science, or admit defeat? Certainly where I'm sitting at present, there's nothing that I've seen that makes me think that the explanation lies outside of known science.
Going back to all the different solutions or approaches within your book, I mean, there's a lot of fun ones, and you have like things kind of like some sort of like zoo, or like a kind of prime directive like in Star Trek, or you have like solar chauvinism. There's lots of different ones. I'd love if maybe you can share some of the ones that maybe they're not compelling to you, but are kind of the most fun ones that you had a chance, but as well as ones, and this is also something that I find interesting. I feel like there are often answers people give to certain problems. And I imagine Fermi Paradox is an example, is one of these where people think there's a very compelling answer, and it's very popular, but many people, including experts in these areas, find them completely uncompelling. I'd hope you can kind of just share, like, yeah, some fun ones as well as ones that people think are really compelling and are just not.
Okay, the favorite solutions, that's difficult because it tends to change depending on the last thing I've been thinking about.
That's fair.
Like solutions that involve the moon, because as I was explaining earlier, with the possibility of the solar system being formed from a collision and that being a rare event, a relatively rare event, we think the moon really did come into being from a collision. An object billions of years ago, close collision with Earth, and the moon was created. And we now are part of effectively a double planet Earth-Moon system. And the moon might well have played a role in allowing us to evolve in the way we have. I won't go into details, but there are some interesting thoughts that people have had about the importance of the moon.
And is that also related to the fact that, given that we are sort of this double planet system, that presumably is somewhat rare and so therefore makes us kind of unlikely? Other systems kind of have.
Well, there are a lot of moons in the solar system.
Sure.
But the particular moon that we have ended up with,
right? It is a very big moon.
It's a big moon, and it has certain properties to do with the size and where it is, that if that collision happened again and it happened just a few hours later or slightly different collision parameters, we wouldn't have the moon that we currently have. So I find that somehow quite interesting. It might be a complete red herring, but I do find it interesting. Another fun solution, again, it's because I've been thinking about it recently. I've just completed a book about 1956. It was in some ways a high point in my mind of science fiction. So Forbidden Planet was released, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Asimov and Heinlein and Clarke had novels out. It was a peak year, and there was lots of other interesting things going on in the broader world. And Asimov published that year, 1956, his favourite story of his own. With typical modesty, he said it was the best story ever written in science fiction, and it's called The Last Question. I can give spoilers, can't I? Because it's 70 years old.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
It's essentially...
If you do not want to hear what happens about this, yes, skip over the next couple minutes. But otherwise, right, it's been a while.
Fast forward. But very briefly, it's about a computer called Multivac, and people operating this computer ask this incredible machine, can you reverse entropy? An egg breaks. Once it's broken, that's it. Can you that's an increase in entropy. Can you decrease entropy? And the computer thinks and says insufficient data for a meaningful answer. And the thing about entropy is the universe will die eventually in a heat death when entropy is maximized. So it's an important question. Can you reverse it? And 6 times this question is asked of this computer over vast stretches of time. And each time the computer is more powerful. Eventually it merges with humanity, transcends in some way. It leaves the universe, it becomes outside of time and space. And it's still thinking about this question that has been asked 6 times. Is there any way of reversing entropy? And eventually it comes up with an idea, a solution to this question, but there's no one around. The universe is now empty for it to give the answer to. So it decides this amalgam of humanity and computational power, decides to render the answer through a demonstration. And it says, let there be light. So it's created the universe. Now, either it's some sort of paradox and it has created itself at the beginning, or it's a cyclic universe. It's created a new universe that other beings can eventually emerge from. The reason I mention it is that what I think is a fun idea, Roger Penrose, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, he has this idea of a cyclical cosmology. It's not mainstream, but he gives arguments in favor of a cyclical cosmology. And he suggests, well, maybe these beings from the previous eon could squeeze a message through the bounce, and we could even see it in the cosmic microwave background radiation. I found that really astonishing solution, that you could actually see evidence in the universe, in the CMB, the cosmic microwave background. I don't think you can but I found it fun. It's a fun thought.
That's definitely fun and very, very provocative.
Yeah. As for solutions I don't like the people, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. That's sort of, it's a bit of a cheat, I think. You briefly referenced the zoo hypothesis, which is sort of that Star Trek Prime Directive idea. Some scientists that I really respect and admire put all their money on this being the solution. And I don't quite see it. I can understand why they're saying it, because it's an optimistic solution. It implies life is common. It has a broader view of ethics and exploration. It sort of matches what we do with when we explore, what we like to think we would do if we explore. But it just requires such highly coordinated behavior on the part of these aliens that have put us in this zoo and are protecting us, perhaps. It assumes perfect stealth because we haven't seen them. It's really hard to falsify because you just say, well, they are so good at being stealthy. That's the reason we haven't seen them. And it requires aliens to care about us. So I'm not a fan of the zoo hypothesis, although, as I say, I can understand why some people are.
Yeah. And certainly when you're saying about like the like perfect compliance, or like perfect like morale, and there's enough people who jump into zoo enclosures when they shouldn't. I feel like, right, maybe at a multi-species level, maybe it's not necessarily going to go so well either.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering also, and we were talking about scientific advances kind of changing how we think about the likelihood of various different things, or kind of giving us a shape to how we should think about different approaches to the Fermi Paradox, certainly like discovery of extrasolar planets and the like. One of the things that I wonder about is, has like advances in artificial intelligence, has that changed how people might respond to the Fermi Paradox? So one example would be, we actually had a conversation, I think a couple of years ago, on the sister podcast of Lux. I was talking to someone else about this. There's the novel Blind Sight by Peter Watts, I believe. And I guess this is going to be another spoiler, but in it, there's these like highly advanced alien species, but they are they're intelligent, but they are completely they have no consciousness. And they kind of view conscious communication as sort of this like noise or things that's kind of detrimental. And now with LLMs and the like, we're beginning to see evidence of intelligence without consciousness, at least to a certain degree. And depends how you define it. And there's lots and lots of caveats. But has the development of AI or certain technological progress, kind of approaches, even just the fact that we are no longer broadcasting things nearly as much out into the universe as we used to be with radio, we now have things and like staying in wires and the like, whether it's AI or other kinds of technologies, has that changed how you've thought about either technosignatures or even just other solutions or approaches to the paradox?
So the AI, I mean, you mentioned Blind Sight. I just have to, agree with you. It's such a interesting novel, and it's really chilling. I found it such a chilling thought. You just think of the fly moving along and the frog sat there, and the frog just does not need to know about the existence of the fly. It just needs to know if something comes across its vision, snaps out its tongue, gets this thing, comes in. That's all it is. It's sort of a machine on that level. And these creatures in Blind Sight by Peter Watts, effectively, they're like that. It's just this weird thought that the behavior of creatures like that just wouldn't map onto our psyche, the human psyche, at all. And presumably, we just would not. If it turns out that consciousness is perhaps detrimental in some way to survival, intelligence, yes, but consciousness, why do we have it? If that somehow either doesn't arise in the first place or gets selected out, and you end up with creatures that are intelligent but not conscious, would we ever understand what it is that they're doing? It goes back to the point you were making earlier about, can we necessarily understand what it is we see in terms we understand? I think the rise of large language models has weakened that assumption that intelligence does imply communication. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you can have intelligence as instrumental, but not intentional. If that's the case, then yes, it's a strange universe that we live in. In terms of just the technologies of artificial intelligence, one element of the Fermi Paradox, as it was thought about many years ago, is in terms of colonization, sending out probes to colonize the galaxy. If you're going to do that, it's difficult to send out spaceships that have got people on board, beings, whatever. You got to carry all that water and the food and all the rest of it. And yes, there are ways that you might do it with generation ships or cryonics or whatever, but it would be presumably a lot easier to send out what are called self-replicating von Neumann probes. And one element of a von Neumann probe would be intelligence. And maybe we're reaching the stage now where we could start to think about building something like a probe that could go out, land on a planet, do what probes are currently doing as we currently have it on Mars, but to a much, much greater extent, perhaps prepare a planet for future colonists. And you can imagine waves of colonization going out. A von Neumann probe lands on a planet, searches around, it gets the raw material to replicate itself, and then shoot off to another planet, leaving some people, some probes behind to do whatever it is that they're being programmed to do, and they'd have the intelligence built in to do what it is that they need to do. And then, when the next set of probes land on the next planet, rinse and repeat. So you can imagine a wave of colonization spreading through the galaxy by means of probes, and certainly artificial intelligence, I think, would be a necessary component of that.
Is that related? I mean, I was also going to ask about, are there anything that feels truly novel in terms of approaches? Because I know, and when you're talking about the von Neumann probes and kind of spreading throughout a galaxy, the professor Robin Hansen has this thing around grabby aliens, which I think has similarities to some of the percolation models that I think you discuss as well. And that also is kind of this wave of colonization, and maybe we were kind of passed by, or we're about to be experiencing it, and so therefore we don't see anything until right as we're about to be colonized or whatever. I might have combined multiple different approaches, but yeah, are there any qualitatively new approaches recently that you feel people have made towards this paradox?
Well, let me give you a couple. Since you mentioned grabby aliens, I'll talk about that if I can, because it's happened fairly recently. The paper 3-4 years ago, something like that. So certainly it's not covered in the book, and it would need to be in a third edition. And the grabby aliens hypothesis from Hansen, and he had 3 co-workers on it. Incidentally, talking about interdisciplinary aspects, Hansen's an economist. One of the co-authors is a physicist. Another is a software engineer. Another is a machine learning expert. So that's wonderful. Interdisciplinary. But it addresses a philosophical puzzle, which is quite interesting. So it doesn't have a particular model of colonization in mind, other than if they arise, these grabby aliens, they're just going to go out at some fraction of the speed of light, some quite large fraction, and grab everything. The reason they postulate this is quite interesting, I think. So you have this idea of the hard steps model of reaching human level intelligence. It's a guy called Brandon Carter came up with it. There's a number of steps, the number we don't know, but a number of hard steps that have to be accomplished in order to reach intelligence. So you need abiogenesis. Presumably that is one of the hard steps, getting from non-living matter to living matter. You've got to get multicellularity, perhaps that's a hard step. You've got to develop intelligence, perhaps that's a hard step, and so on. And if these hard steps need lots of time to accomplish, then you would expect things to happen late. Now, we have arrived late, humans have arrived late compared to the peak of star formation in the universe. But it turns out we have appeared extremely early compared to the total number of years available. So if you look at the reference class of civilizations that could appear on planets around stars, the vast majority of civilizations are going to arise on planets around dim stars, red dwarf type stars, because there's just so many of those stars and they shine for trillions of years. We have about 1 billion years left before the sun starts making things difficult for us here on Earth. But red dwarfs, they go on for trillions of years. So in the total amount of real estate available, if you like, for the generation of intelligences is around those sorts of K-type stars. So then you have this question, well, why are we here so early when you would expect maybe 99.9% of civilizations to arrive in the distant future around one of those small stars? So the suggestion of the grubby aliens hypothesis is that we aren't early because there's a deadline looming. And the deadline that they give is this wave of colonization from a grubby alien civilization. So they say that there's tons of life out there, tons of grubby alien life, and you have these waves of colonization that take place. They grab what they can and they suppress, because they're changing the volume of space that they're living in, they suppress the generation of new intelligences. So if you're a quiet civilization, quiet alien civilization, you're going to get outcompeted or not come into being at all because of these grubby aliens. So it's not that we're randomly early in this case, we're necessarily early, because if we were later, we wouldn't be around. So they've put this deadline in, and that's, I think, quite a neat way of thinking about it. I think, though, you can criticize the hypothesis because the puzzle disappears if it turns out that red dwarf stars are not good places for the evolution of life. And then all sorts of reasons why that might be the case. Tidal locking, the planets have to be closer to the star, much more likely to be tidally locked to the star, which is not a good thing. Solar flares, that because they're closer to the star, they might get irradiated from flares. High levels of radiation at the start of the star's life. So I think it's easy to imagine a solution to that puzzle, why are we here early, in terms of astrophysics, which is just that red dwarf stars are not good places to develop intelligence. And maybe you need a planet around a sun-like star, which sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's very anthropomorphic. Maybe you need something like the sun and the planet going around the sun. But there's only about 6% of the stars are sun-like. So it's a really interesting new development, I think. And it's certainly one I would like to explore a bit more if there is a third edition of the book. More recently, a Japanese physicist looked at this idea of abiogenesis. How do you get from non-life to life? And he ran some calculations about how you could generate the simplest self-replicating RNA molecule, which might be a precursor to the more complicated DNA world that we're in. So the idea is that you start off with chemical blocks, you mash them all together, and then eventually, by chance, you get a self-replicating RNA molecule, which can not only self-replicate, but also has the function of metabolism. And once you have those two things, you've sort of got life. And then things could kick in and you eventually get to DNA. But he ran the calculations of just if you're going to do this randomly, these basic building blocks, and you're smashing them together, and you need a chain of about 40 of these building blocks. Turns out that the universe is not big enough or old enough to accept the combinatorics involved. There's just so many different combinations of these things that it just isn't going to happen by chance. So either there's something that we're missing that sort of drives this process, or he said, the universe isn't big enough, but the multiverse that we believe that we're part of would be. If you believe cosmic inflation, then the observable universe that we see is only part of a much bigger structure. And if you have the multiverse, then yes, it's big enough for life to come around by chance. But then we wouldn't be just alone in the universe. We'd effectively be alone in universes we don't even see, parts of the universe that we don't even see. So that, again, I think was a fun approach. Again, it might be wrong because there may well be other ways of getting to life from non-life, but it gives you a flavor of how people are still thinking, 75 years on, of different ways of approaching this question.
I love this. This is fascinating. Maybe for a last question, and we've talked about science fiction and kind of how it's had an impact on the Fermi Paradox and vice versa. Has your book had any, has it been the inspiration for any science fiction that you're aware of? people have kind of used it as the grist for stories?
Unfortunately, not that I'm aware of. What I am aware of, and what is absolutely wonderful, and I'll do a shout out now if I can. In the books and in talks, I ask for people to contact me if they have their own ideas on this. And it's such a joy to get suggestions from people. Sometimes it's science fiction writers. Sometimes it's just members of the public who happen to have an interest in this sort of thing. And some of the suggestions are really quite insightful. And that is, for me, one of the joys of having written the book is the contacts that I've made in the conversations like this that we can have. And I'd throw it back to you, Sam. Do you have any thoughts?
I don't think I have any novel suggestions. That's pretty great.
Do you have a feel for?
For where where I come down on? Oh, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think I want the answer to be that there are aliens and we just haven't found them yet. But I am lean more and more towards the final category, which is that we are, and certainly changes kind of how we think, how we think about ourselves. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe this is the way we've always thought about humanity, and it maybe just makes it that much more precious. Yeah, I would say I'm somewhere in between the tension between those two different categories.
Yeah, and I can understand why. And as I say, I hope that I'm wrong, and it would be wonderful, hopefully, to make contact. There is, I guess, that nagging thought that maybe if we did make contact, it would be with civilizations that are much more advanced than us, and therefore, if they wanted to, or if they had not our best concerns at heart, then it might be troublesome. So there is that question, I guess, of METI, not just SETI, but METI, the messaging of extraterrestrial intelligence. Should we, given our current understanding, broadcast our presence to the universe? But yeah, I think it would be just such an incredible thing to know that we're living in the Star Trek universe rather than this empty universe. So I hope I'm wrong.
I share your hope. Anyway, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Really enjoyed it, Sam.